Hey there, and welcome to Crime for Sleep. I know you're having trouble falling asleep, so let me keep you company with true crime stories from around the world. Before we dive in, I'm curious, where did you first hear this one? If you enjoy these stories, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Now get comfortable, and let's get into tonight's case. Story 1. Every morning, like clockwork, the old journal sat undisturbed on the entry table, open to a different page, as though someone had left it mid-read. It was an ordinary artifact of the household, its presence as regular as the sunrise. Initially, my eyes would skim over the looping, faded ink without much thought, an erratic assortment of mundane details, shopping lists interspersed with half-finished musings. But a week ago, I noticed a line underlined twice, a habit foreign to its usual script. The next day, a dog-eared page appeared, a peculiar mark where none had been. Today, a subtle shift in the paper's arrangement catches my attention, a single page missing, yet no one else seems to notice. I knew exactly what was happening. Someone in the house was reading through the journal systematically, studying it with purpose. The evidence was clear to me: the careful progression through the pages, the deliberate markings, the methodical approach. It had to be my housemate, the one who'd moved in 3 months earlier after responding to my roommate advertisement. They were curious about the previous tenant's belongings, probably searching for something valuable or interesting hidden within those mundane entries. The explanation satisfied me completely. People are naturally curious, especially about the lives of strangers who once occupied their space. The journal belonged to whoever had lived here before either of us, forgotten in the chaos of moving. My housemate was simply indulging in harmless snooping, the kind of behavior anyone might exhibit when faced with such an intimate glimpse into another person's daily thoughts. I felt no concern about this discovery. If anything, I found it mildly amusing. The journal contained nothing scandalous, just grocery lists, weather observations, and scattered reflections on ordinary events. Whoever was reading it would find themselves disappointed by the lack of drama or revelation. I imagined them flipping through page after page, hoping for secrets that would never materialize. The routine continued for several more days. Each morning brought subtle changes to the journal's position and condition. New pencil marks appeared in the margins. Certain passages seemed to catch the reader's attention more than others, judging by the frequency of annotations. I began to anticipate these discoveries. Checking the journal before my morning coffee became part of my daily ritual. But then I noticed something that didn't align with my theory. The handwriting in the margins wasn't my housemate's. I'd seen their writing on shopping lists stuck to the refrigerator, on notes left for the building superintendent. The script was entirely different, smaller, more cramped, with a distinctive slant that belonged to neither of us. The realization stopped me cold as I stood in the entryway, coffee mug halfway to my lips. I tried to rationalize this inconsistency. Perhaps my housemate had changed their handwriting deliberately, attempting to disguise their involvement. People sometimes alter their script when they don't want to be identified, or maybe I'd been mistaken about the handwriting on those refrigerator notes. Memory can be unreliable, especially regarding details we never expected to matter. Yet the explanation felt forced, artificial. I found myself studying the journal more intently, comparing the various handwriting samples with growing unease. The original entries, faded with age, belonged to one person. The recent annotations belonged to someone else entirely, and the handwriting on our household notes belonged to a third individual altogether. That evening, I decided to address the situation directly. I approached my housemate while they prepared dinner, mentioning casually that I'd noticed someone had been reading the old journal in the entryway. Their response caught me off guard. They looked genuinely puzzled, claiming they'd never paid attention to the journal beyond noting its presence. When I described the markings and annotations, their confusion seemed authentic. "I thought you were the one reading it," they said, stirring pasta sauce with deliberate focus. "I assumed it belonged to you." The conversation left me more unsettled than before. Either my housemate was lying convincingly, or my certainty about the situation had been completely misplaced. I returned to the journal that night, examining it under the bright overhead light in the entryway. The annotations were definitely there, definitely recent, definitely written by someone with access to our home. I began to reconsider everything I thought I knew about the journal's history. Had it really belonged to a previous tenant? I'd assumed so because it was already there when I moved in, but I'd never actually confirmed this with the landlord. The journal could have appeared more recently, placed there by someone with their own agenda. The entries themselves took on new significance as I read them with fresh perspective. What I'd initially dismissed as mundane observations now seemed potentially meaningful. References to watching from the window could indicate surveillance. Comments about the routine never changes might suggest someone studying the habits of others. Lists of seemingly random items could be codes or signals. My sleep became restless as questions multiplied in my mind. Who had access to our home? The landlord possessed keys, certainly, but why would they be interested in leaving cryptic journals? Maintenance workers occasionally entered for repairs, but none had visited recently. I tried to remember if I'd given keys to anyone else, friends, family members, romantic partners, but my memory felt unreliable. I started paying closer attention to signs of intrusion. Were objects in other rooms being moved or examined? I began noting the exact position of items before leaving the house, checking for changes upon my return. A book on the coffee table seemed to shift slightly. The angle of a picture frame looked different, or perhaps I was becoming paranoid, seeing patterns where none existed. The journal continued its daily transformations. New pages appeared with fresh markings, always in that same cramped handwriting I couldn't identify. I considered removing the journal entirely, hiding it or throwing it away, but something held me back. It had become evidence of something, though I couldn't articulate what. I found myself studying my housemate with new scrutiny. Their denials about reading the journal seemed less convincing in retrospect. Everyone lies occasionally, especially about small transgressions. Maybe they felt embarrassed about their curiosity and chose to deny involvement rather than admit to snooping. Their body language during our conversation replayed in my memory the way they'd avoided eye contact, the defensive tone, the quick change of subject. But then I remembered my own behavior lately. The increased attention to the journal, the careful examination of handwriting samples, the detailed analysis of seemingly innocent entries. If someone had been watching me, they would have witnessed all of this. They would have seen me hovering over the journal each morning, making my own mental notes about its condition and contents. A disturbing possibility began to form in my mind. What if I was the one making the annotations? What if stress or sleep deprivation had caused me to forget my own actions? I'd heard of people performing complex tasks while sleepwalking, leaving no conscious memory of their behavior. The handwriting in the margins looked unfamiliar, but handwriting can change when someone is tired or distracted. I tested this theory by examining my own script under various conditions. Writing with my non-dominant hand produced a cramped, unfamiliar style. Writing while exhausted created a different slant and pressure. Writing while anxious made my letters smaller and more compressed. None of these variations exactly matched the journal annotations, but they demonstrated how much my handwriting could change. The uncertainty was becoming unbearable. I needed to know who was responsible for the journal's ongoing transformation. I decided to set up a simple test, placing the journal in a specific position and checking for changes at regular intervals. If someone was manipulating it while I was home, I would eventually catch them in the act. But the test revealed nothing conclusive. Changes still occurred, but always during periods when I couldn't account for every moment. A brief nap, a long shower, a trip to the basement laundry room, any of these absences could provide opportunity for someone to access the journal, or for me to access it myself if my unconscious mind was somehow involved. I began to question everything about my living situation. How well did I really know my housemate? We'd had limited interaction before they moved in, just a brief interview and reference check. They'd seemed normal, responsible, trustworthy, but people can hide their true nature, especially when it serves their purposes. What did I actually know about their background, their motivations, their mental state? Then again, what did they know about mine? I'd been acting strangely lately, obsessing over a journal that might be completely innocent. If someone was watching me, they would have observed increasingly erratic behavior. My morning ritual of checking the journal, my careful examination of handwriting samples, my growing paranoia about intrusion, all of this could appear deeply suspicious to an outside observer. The journal entries themselves began to feel more personal, as if they were addressing me directly. References to the morning routine echoed my own daily habits. Mentions of coffee growing cold matched my experience of becoming distracted while reading. Comments about patterns within patterns seemed to describe my current state of mind perfectly. I started to wonder if the journal was somehow connected to my own history. Had I written these entries myself during some forgotten period? The original ink looked old, but appearances could be deceiving. Had I created this mystery as some kind of elaborate psychological experiment? The idea seemed absurd, yet I couldn't entirely dismiss it. My relationship with my housemate grew strained as suspicion poisoned our interactions. I found myself analyzing their every word and gesture for signs of deception. They seemed to be doing the same to me. Conversations became stilted and artificial. We began avoiding each other, creating an atmosphere of mutual distrust that permeated the entire house. The journal seemed to thrive in this environment of uncertainty. The annotations became more frequent and more cryptic. Entire passages were highlighted or circled. New symbols appeared in the margins, arrows, question marks, small drawings that might have been meaningful or might have been random doodles. The handwriting itself seemed to be evolving, becoming more confident and assertive. I realized I could no longer distinguish between what I knew and what I suspected. The boundary between observation and interpretation had blurred beyond recognition. Facts had become contaminated by assumption, memory had been corrupted by anxiety, and truth had dissolved into a maze of competing possibilities. The journal sits before me now, open to a page I don't remember seeing before. The handwriting looks familiar and foreign at the same time. The words seem to pulse with hidden meaning, but I can't decode their significance. Someone has been reading this journal, studying it, annotating it with purpose and intention. Someone with access to this house, someone with knowledge of our routines, someone with their own agenda. I just can't be certain whether that someone is me. Story 2. The dull snap of the switch echoed as I released it. The room had been dim, but now an unusual glow seeped through the blinds, casting long stripes across the worn carpet. My skin tingled with the sudden shift in temperature, the subtle touch of cool air brushing past me. Behind me, the hum of the refrigerator stopped too abruptly, leaving a vacuum of sound that made my pulse feel loud in my ears. The air was heavy, charged, almost like it was waiting. And in the quiet, I realized my breath was the only thing moving. I knew what had happened here. The The power outage had been building for hours, flickering lights, the occasional surge through the walls. The electrical grid in this neighborhood had always been unstable, especially during storms. When I'd arrived at the apartment that evening, everything seemed normal. My neighbor had asked me to check on things while she was away, water the plants, make sure nothing was amiss. Simple enough. The switch I'd just flipped controlled the main circuit breaker. Standard procedure when you suspect an electrical fault. Cut the power, let the system reset, avoid any potential damage. I'd done this dozens of times in my work as a building maintenance supervisor. The routine was second nature: assess the situation, isolate the problem, take corrective action. The unusual glow from outside was probably just the emergency lighting from the complex kicking in. The temperature change was normal too. When HVAC systems shut down suddenly, you always get that brief shift in air pressure. Everything had a logical explanation. The apartment felt different now, sure, but that was just the absence of all those background electrical sounds we never consciously notice. The refrigerator's compressor, the subtle buzz from light fixtures, the whisper of forced air through vents. Remove all that and any space feels hollow, expectant. I walked through the living room, checking that the appliances were properly disconnected. The television sat dark and silent, its screen reflecting those strange stripes of light from the window. My footsteps sounded too loud against the hardwood floor. The plants by the window, a small collection of succulents and one larger fern, seemed fine. Their leaves caught the glow from outside, creating intricate shadow patterns on the wall behind them. But as I moved toward the kitchen, something nagged at me. The refrigerator had stopped too abruptly. Usually when you kill power to a building, there's a gradual wind down of mechanical systems. Motors don't just cut off, they coast to a stop. This had been different, immediate, sharp, like someone had yanked a cord from a wall socket. I opened the refrigerator door and the interior light didn't come on. Of course it didn't. No power, but the air that escaped felt wrong somehow. Not the expected cool breath you get from an appliance that had been running normally. This was warmer, stale, like it had been off for much longer than the few minutes since I'd thrown the switch. The milk in the door was room temperature. I touched the carton and it felt almost warm. That wasn't right. Even if the power had been out for an hour, dairy products would still retain some coolness. I checked the freezer compartment. The ice cream was soft, nearly melted. The ice cubes in the tray were mostly water. My certainty began to waver. How long had the power actually been out? My neighbor had left 3 days ago, but she'd specifically mentioned that everything was working fine when she departed. I'd spoken to her just that morning, and she hadn't mentioned any problems. Yet the evidence in front of me suggested the refrigerator had been without power for hours, maybe longer. I tried to remember exactly what I'd observed when I'd first entered the apartment. Had the lights been on, I thought I remembered flipping a wall switch when I came in, but now I wasn't sure if it had actually illuminated anything. The apartment had seemed dim, but I'd attributed that to the heavy curtains and the overcast evening outside. The more I thought about it, the more uncertain I became. The electrical panel was located in a small closet near the front door. When I'd opened it and seen the main breaker in the off position, I'd assumed it had tripped due to a power surge. But what if it had been manually switched off? What if someone had deliberately cut the power to this apartment? I walked back to the living room, looking at everything with fresh eyes. The stripes of light coming through the blinds seemed brighter now, more defined. I approached the window and peered through the slats. The glow wasn't coming from emergency lighting at all. It was from the apartment building across the courtyard, where every window blazed with normal electrical illumination. The power outage, if there had been one, was isolated to this unit. The silence felt different now, not the peaceful quiet of a temporarily powered down space, but something more deliberate, more concealing. I found myself listening for sounds that might be masked by the absence of electrical noise. The building's old pipes creaked somewhere in the walls. A door closed softly in another part of the complex. And underneath it all, a sound so faint I almost missed it, a rhythmic tapping, like fingernails against wood. I followed the sound toward the bedroom, my footsteps careful and measured. The door was slightly ajar, and I pushed it open slowly. The room was darker than the rest of the apartment, the single window covered by thick curtains that blocked most of the outside light. But I could make out the basic shapes: bed, dresser, a chair in the corner with clothes draped over it. The tapping had stopped. I stood in the doorway, letting my eyes adjust to the dimness. The bed was unmade, sheets tangled and pushed to one side. That struck me as odd. My neighbor was meticulous about her living space, the type of person who made her bed every morning without fail. But maybe she'd been in a hurry when she left for her trip. Or maybe someone else had been in the bed more recently. The thought came unbidden, and I tried to push it away. I was letting the strange atmosphere of the place get to me. There had to be a reasonable explanation for everything I was observing. The power had been off longer than I'd initially thought. The refrigerator's contents had warmed up over time. The bed had been left unmade in a moment of uncharacteristic carelessness. Simple. But as I approached the bed, I caught a scent that made me pause. It was faint but distinct, a cologne or aftershave that I didn't recognize, something woody and sharp. My neighbor lived alone and rarely had guests. The smell was too fresh to be a lingering trace from some previous visit. I backed away from the bed and returned to the living room, my mind racing. The pieces weren't fitting together the way they should. The deliberately switched off power, the long spoiled food, the unmade bed and unfamiliar scent. Each detail by itself might have an innocent explanation, but together they painted a picture that made my skin crawl. I pulled out my phone to call my neighbor, but there was no signal. The screen showed full bars, but when I tried to dial, the call wouldn't connect. I tried again with the same result. Emergency calls only, the display read, as if the cell towers in this area were experiencing some kind of interference. The apartment felt smaller now, more confining. The stripes of light from the window had shifted as the evening progressed, creating new patterns on the wall. Shadows that looked almost like figures, tall and angular, reaching across the room toward where I stood. I decided to leave. Whatever was going on here, I could sort it out later, in daylight, maybe with someone else present. I'd done what my neighbor had asked, checked on the apartment, identified the power issue. The plants would survive another day without water. But when I reached for the front door handle, it wouldn't turn. The deadbolt was engaged, and I couldn't remember locking it when I'd come in. I always left doors unlocked when I was just making a quick maintenance check. The key my neighbor had given me would open the lock from the outside, but from the inside, you needed to manually turn the deadbolt mechanism. The metal was stiff, resistant. It felt like it hadn't been moved in a long time, as if the lock had been engaged for days. I put more pressure on it, and finally it gave way with a sharp click that echoed through the quiet apartment. As I opened the door, I glanced back at the living room one more time. The light patterns had shifted again, and for just a moment I could have sworn I saw movement near the bedroom doorway. A shadow that didn't match the geometry of the furniture, too fluid and purposeful to be just a trick of the light. I stepped into the hallway and pulled the door closed behind me, my hands shaking slightly as I turned the key in the lock. The corridor was bright and normal, filled with the familiar sounds of a functioning building, air conditioning, distant televisions, the murmur of conversation from behind other doors. The contrast with the silent apartment made everything I just experienced feel surreal, like emerging from a dream. But dreams don't leave you with the lingering scent of unfamiliar cologne on your clothes. Dreams don't explain why your neighbor's spare key felt warm in your palm, as if someone else had been handling it recently. And dreams certainly don't account for the fact that when I looked back at the apartment's front window, the blinds were now closed completely, though I was certain I'd left them partially open. I walked quickly toward the building's exit, but with each step more questions surfaced. How well did I really know my neighbor? Our relationship had always been cordial but distant, occasional small talk in the hallway, the exchange of spare keys for mutual convenience. I realized I knew almost nothing about her personal life, her relationships, her routines. The request to check on her apartment had come in a text message. I'd assumed it was from her, but now I couldn't recall if I'd ever actually verified the sender. The message had come from a number I didn't recognize, but it had included details that seemed to confirm her identity, the location of the spare key, the types of plants that needed watering, the quirky way the front door lock sometimes stuck. But anyone who'd spent time in that apartment would know those details. Outside, the evening air felt cool and clean after the stifling atmosphere of the apartment. I sat in my car for a long time, engine running, trying to make sense of what I'd experienced. The logical part of my mind insisted that I was overreacting, that stress and an overactive imagination had transformed a simple maintenance call into something sinister. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd stumbled into the middle of something I didn't understand, that the apartment held secrets I wasn't supposed to discover, that my presence there had been anticipated, maybe even orchestrated. The question that haunted me most was the simplest one. Where was my neighbor right now? I'd received that text message asking me to check on her apartment, but I hadn't actually spoken to her in person for weeks. What if she'd never left for a trip at all? What if she was still there, somewhere I hadn't looked, unable to call for help? Or what if she'd left under circumstances that had nothing to do with vacation plans? I drove home through streets that seemed too quiet, past buildings where lights flickered in windows like coded messages. Every shadow looked significant, every parked car potentially occupied by someone watching. The paranoia felt ridiculous, but I couldn't turn it off. At home, I tried calling my neighbor's number, but it went straight to voicemail. Her voice sounded strange to me now, distant and formal. I left a message saying I'd checked on the apartment and found some electrical issues that might need professional attention. I didn't mention the other things: the spoiled food, the unmade bed, the scent of cologne, the locked door. I didn't sleep well that night. Every sound in my own apartment seemed amplified and threatening. The refrigerator's hum reminded me of the abrupt silence when the power had cut off. The settling of the building's old frame sounded like footsteps in empty rooms. In the morning, I convinced myself that daylight would restore my perspective. I'd been tired and stressed, prone to reading too much into ordinary circumstances. The apartment had felt strange because it had been without power for longer than I'd initially realized. The rest was just my imagination filling in gaps with worst-case scenarios. But when I checked my phone, there was another text message from that same unrecognized number. It thanked me for checking on the apartment and asked if I'd noticed anything unusual. The tone was casual, friendly, but something about the phrasing made my stomach tighten. How did the sender know I'd already been there? I hadn't mentioned completing the task in my voicemail message the night before. And why ask if I'd noticed anything unusual unless there was something unusual to notice? I stared at the message for a long time, trying to decide how to respond. The smart thing would be to ask directly who I was communicating with, to demand proof of identity. but part of me was afraid of what the answer might be. Instead, I typed back a simple response. Everything seemed fine. Power was out, but I reset the breaker. I didn't mention the spoiled food or the other details that had troubled me. If this really was my neighbor, there was no point in worrying her. If it wasn't, I didn't want to reveal how much I'd observed. The reply came back almost immediately. "Thank you so much. I'll be back soon to check on everything myself." That message chilled me more than anything else, because I was suddenly certain with a clarity that cut through all my previous uncertainty that whoever had sent it had never left town at all. Story 3. I stood rooted, eyes fixed on the curtain that swayed though no breeze brushed my skin. The room held its breath, save for the subtle creaking of the floorboards, a sound that seemed to echo from no distinct origin. Light filtered through the window at an odd angle, casting unfamiliar patterns on the wall. Despite the stillness, an uncanny ripple of movement whispered across the periphery of my vision, fading before I could grasp it. The clock continued its steady ticking, yet the minute hand never seemed to advance. Then unexpectedly, a shadow elongated across the floor that hadn't been there seconds before, trailing from somewhere unseen. The shadow belonged to someone who should have been elsewhere. That much I knew, even as I questioned everything else about that afternoon. The certainty sat heavy in my chest, a weight I'd been carrying without realizing it until this moment when the truth finally surfaced like debris after a storm. But when did the suspicion truly begin? Memory plays such peculiar tricks, folding time until cause and effect blur into one continuous loop of doubt. Perhaps it started with the photograph I found tucked between the pages of a cookbook, its edges worn soft from handling. A picture of a place I'd never been, yet somehow familiar in the way that made my stomach clench with recognition I couldn't name. The woman in the photograph stood beside a wooden fence, her hand resting on the weathered post in a gesture so casual it felt rehearsed. Her smile was the kind that doesn't reach the eyes, the kind I'd learned to recognize in my own reflection during those weeks when questions multiplied faster than answers. I remember studying that photograph until the details burned themselves into my mind. The way her hair caught the light, the particular slant of her shoulders, the small tear in the fence behind her, shaped like a crescent moon. Every element seemed to whisper of significance, though I couldn't decipher the language. The kitchen where I found the photograph had always been my sanctuary, a place where routine provided comfort. But that afternoon, even the familiar felt foreign. The way sunlight struck the counter revealed fingerprints I didn't remember leaving. The refrigerator hummed a slightly different tune. The salt shaker sat 3 inches to the left of where I always placed it, a displacement so minor yet so absolute that it made me question my own memory. Memory, I've learned, is less reliable than we pretend. It reshapes itself to accommodate new information, smoothing over inconsistencies like water filling the gaps between stones. What I thought I remembered about that week began to shift once I allowed doubt to take root. She had been different, yes, but different how? The change was subtle, like watching someone's face age in photographs taken over many seasons. You know something has shifted, but you can't pinpoint the precise moment of transformation. Her laugh came a fraction of a second too late. Her attention drifted during conversations that should have held her interest. She began checking her reflection in windows, mirrors, any surface that could show her face back to herself. The phone calls started then, or perhaps I simply started noticing them. Brief conversations conducted in the hallway, her voice pitched lower than usual. When I asked who had called, her answers came too quickly, too smoothly, like responses she'd practiced. Old friends, she said, work colleagues, family members with minor concerns that required immediate attention. I wanted to believe her. Belief is so much easier than the alternative, so much kinder to the heart that still hoped for simple explanations. But doubt, once introduced, spreads like ink in water, coloring everything it touches. The evening I found her standing in the garden, perfectly still among the roses, I almost convinced myself it was natural. People need solitude, time to think, space to breathe. But she stood there for so long that I began to count the minutes, then lost track as the light faded and still she remained motionless, her face turned toward the street as if waiting for something to appear. When I joined her, she startled like someone waking from a dream. Her explanation came in fragments. She'd been admiring the flowers, listening to the birds, enjoying the cool air. All reasonable things, yet her hands shook as she spoke, and her eyes kept darting back toward the street. That night I lay awake listening to the sounds of the house settling around us. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind against the windows seemed amplified, meaningful. She slept beside me with the stillness of someone feigning unconsciousness, her breathing too controlled, too measured. The pattern repeated itself over the following days. Small deviations from routine that individually meant nothing but collectively painted a picture I didn't want to see. The way she jumped when the mail arrived, her sudden interest in locking doors that had never been locked before, the careful way she arranged her belongings as if preparing for a departure she hadn't mentioned. I began to study her the way I'd studied that photograph, searching for clues in the familiar landscape of someone I thought I knew completely. The birthmark on her shoulder that I'd kissed countless times suddenly seemed like evidence of something, though evidence of what remained unclear. The scar on her palm from a childhood accident took on new significance, as if her past itself had become suspect. Questions multiplied in the quiet spaces between conversation. Where did she go during those long walks she'd recently begun taking? Why did she delete text messages immediately after reading them? What caused that particular expression that crossed her face when she thought I wasn't watching? A look of such profound sadness that it made me wonder what sorrows she carried that I'd never been allowed to share. The rational part of my mind offered explanations: stress from work, hormonal changes, the natural ebb and flow of any long relationship. But rationality felt fragile against the weight of accumulated small mysteries, like a paper umbrella in a hurricane. I found myself checking the details of our shared life with new scrutiny. The grocery receipts that didn't match the food in our refrigerator, the extra mileage on her car that couldn't be accounted for by her usual routes, the way certain songs made her expression change, as if the music carried memories I wasn't part of. The photograph haunted me. I returned to it repeatedly, studying the woman's face as if it held answers to questions I was afraid to ask directly. Who had taken the picture? When had it been captured? Why had it been hidden in a cookbook we rarely used, tucked between recipes for dishes she claimed not to know how to make? Sleep became elusive. I would lie in the darkness, hyper-aware of every sound, every movement. The house seemed to expand and contract around us, full of spaces I'd never noticed before, corners where shadows gathered differently, rooms that felt larger or smaller depending on the light. Even our bedroom, the most intimate of spaces, began to feel like foreign territory. The morning I woke to find her side of the bed cold and undisturbed, I knew something fundamental had shifted. She stood in the kitchen, fully dressed, drinking coffee from a cup I didn't recognize. Her suitcase waited by the door, packed with an efficiency that spoke of careful planning. Her explanation came in the same measured tones she'd been using for weeks. A family emergency, a friend in need, a work obligation that required immediate travel. The details varied depending on which version she told, but the core remained the same. She had to leave, and she couldn't say when she'd return. I wanted to ask the questions that had been building inside me like pressure in a sealed container. Instead, I nodded and helped her carry the suitcase to her car. We kissed goodbye with the awkward politeness of strangers, and I watched her drive away with the strange relief of someone finally acknowledging what they'd been trying not to see. The house felt different in her absence, not empty, but somehow more honest. Without the need to pretend normalcy, I could finally examine the evidence that had been accumulating like sediment in still water. The photograph was just the beginning. I found other things, receipts for places she'd never mentioned visiting. A second phone charger hidden in a drawer that contained no phone. Clothes I'd never seen her wear, still tagged and tucked behind garments I recognized. Each discovery felt like finding pieces of a puzzle, though the final picture remained frustratingly unclear. The neighbors began to look at me differently, with the particular mixture of pity and curiosity reserved for those who have been left behind. Their questions came wrapped in concern, but I could hear the hunger for details underneath. Had there been signs? Had I suspected? Was I surprised? Surprised, the word felt inadequate for the complex mixture of emotions that had taken up residence in my chest. Relief mingled with grief, anger danced with understanding. I'd been living with a stranger, but perhaps we all are strangers, even to ourselves. Weeks passed in a haze of routine disrupted. I found myself standing in rooms trying to remember what I'd come there to do. The photograph remained on the kitchen counter, no longer hidden but not quite displayed either. Sometimes I caught myself talking to the woman in the picture, asking her questions I'd never had the courage to ask in person. The calls started then, brief, wordless connections that lasted just long enough for me to recognize the quality of silence on the other end. Someone listening, breathing, perhaps waiting for me to speak first. I never did. Instead, I listened to the listening, trying to decode meaning from the spaces between sounds. Then came the evening when I returned home to find evidence of visitation. Nothing dramatic, nothing that couldn't be explained by my own failing memory or the settling of an empty house. But the photograph had been moved, shifted just slightly on the counter. The curtain in the living room hung differently, as if someone had been standing at the window watching the street. I began to understand that leaving and being gone are different things entirely. Presence can linger like perfume in fabric, like warmth in recently vacated chairs. The house held onto traces of her, even as I tried to reclaim the spaces for myself alone. My sleep grew more fractured, filled with dreams that felt less like imagination and more like memory. In these dreams, she returned not as the woman who had left, but as someone I'd never met, someone who knew things about me that I'd never shared. We would have conversations in languages I didn't speak, yet somehow I understood every word. The photograph began to change, or perhaps my perception of it changed. The woman's smile seemed less forced, more knowing. The tear in the fence behind her started to look less like damage and more like an intentional opening, a way through to somewhere else. Even her posture suggested movement rather than stillness, as if she'd been captured in the moment before stepping forward into whatever came next. I realized I'd been looking at the picture wrong from the beginning. It wasn't a portrait of someone posing for the camera. It was a documentation of departure, a record of someone in the process of leaving one life for another. The casual way her hand rested on the fence post wasn't rehearsed. It was a farewell gesture, a final touch before moving on. Understanding brought its own kind of peace, though not the kind I'd expected. The questions that had consumed me began to feel less urgent, less demanding of immediate answers. Perhaps some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, Some departures are meant to be accepted rather than explained. The house gradually became mine again, though it never quite returned to what it had been before. Certain rooms retained an echo of occupancy, a sense that they were being borrowed rather than owned. I learned to live with this haunting, to find comfort in the knowledge that some presences are too strong to be entirely erased. The phone calls continued sporadically, those wordless connections that might have been wrong numbers or might have been something else entirely. I stopped trying to decode their meaning and instead began to appreciate them as a form of communication that transcended language, a way of maintaining connection across whatever distance separated us. Sometimes in the early evening when the light fell at that particular angle, I would stand in the living room and remember the afternoon when everything changed. The way the shadows had shifted without explanation, the sense of movement just beyond the edge of vision, the certainty that someone was present who should have been elsewhere. Now I understand that presence and absence are not opposites but different states of the same condition. Someone can be gone and still be there, can be absent and yet more real than the furniture or the walls or the floor beneath my feet. The heart makes its own geography, creates its own rules of distance and proximity. The photograph remains on the kitchen counter, no longer a mystery to be solved, but a reminder of the complexity of human motivation. We all have fences we need to climb, places we need to go that others cannot follow. The courage to leave is just as profound as the courage to stay, just as worthy of respect. I think of her now not with the desperate questioning that once consumed me, but with a kind of grateful bewilderment. She taught me that love sometimes means allowing someone to become a stranger, that intimacy can coexist with mystery, that the deepest connections often require the greatest distances. The house settles around me as evening approaches, full of the familiar sounds that once seemed ominous but now feel like companionship. The floorboards creak with the weight of memory. The windows frame the changing light like photographs of time passing. Even the curtains move with purpose now, responding to currents of air that flow through spaces both visible and hidden. Standing here in the growing dusk, I find myself rooted once again, eyes fixed on the curtain that sways though no breeze brushes my skin. But now I understand that some movement comes from within, that some shadows are cast by lights we cannot see. The room holds its breath not in anticipation but in acceptance, and I breathe with it, finally at peace with all the beautiful, inexplicable mysteries that make a life worth living. Story 4. The scent was unmistakable lavender with a hint of something sharper, like a laugh that cuts through silence. I halted at the doorway, clutching a book to my chest, the smell swirling around me despite the windows being firmly shut. It didn't belong in this room in this season. Without thinking, I retraced my steps toward the hall where the air felt thick and expectant. Each inhale dragged me deeper into a fog of half-formed images, a shadowed nook, a mirror reflecting nothing but absence. I tried to shake it off, but the fragrance clung to me, pulling me back to when it lingered in air much darker than this. The sensation was undeniable. The book falls from my hands, pages scatter across hardwood like leaves from a tree I can't quite remember. I'm kneeling now, gathering sheets of paper, but my fingers find something else instead. A photograph. Her face stares up at me, though I'm certain this picture wasn't here moments ago. Or was it? Memory doesn't follow straight lines. It curves back on itself, doubles over, leaves gaps where certainty should live. The woman in the photograph wore that same perfume. I'm sure of this, though I can't recall ever meeting her face to face. The detective's voice echoes somewhere behind my thoughts. When did you first notice she was missing? But that's wrong. She wasn't missing, not exactly. People don't just disappear from their own lives without leaving traces. They leave behind scents that cling to curtains, fingerprints on glass surfaces, the faint impression of their body in unmade beds. I stand, photograph still in my palm. The paper feels warm, as if someone else held it recently. The woman's smile doesn't reach her eyes. There's something calculated about the way her lips curve, something that suggests secrets kept in dark places. The apartment was smaller than I expected. This memory surfaces without invitation, sharp and clear. Sunlight streamed through gauze curtains, casting everything in amber tones. Her neighbor had given me the key, though I can't remember why I needed it or what authority I claimed. She always kept things so neat, the neighbor had said. An older woman with silver hair and worried hands. Everything in its place. That's why this doesn't make sense. What didn't make sense was the mess. Drawers pulled open, contents scattered across surfaces, books swept from shelves, their spines cracked against the floor, yet underneath the chaos an odd precision, as if someone had searched for something specific, then tried to make it look random. I found the first note tucked inside a cookbook, between pages about preserving fruit. The handwriting was careful, deliberate. He watches from the building across the street. 3rd floor, corner window. I've started keeping my curtains closed. No date, no context, just fear crystallized in blue ink. The lavender scent grows stronger now, here in my own hallway. I close my eyes and let it transport me back to her bathroom, where bottles line the sink like soldiers. Perfume, lotion, shampoo, all the same scent, all nearly empty, as if she'd been using more than usual. Or as if someone else had been using them. My hands shake as I turn the photograph over. There's writing on the back, but the words blur together. I blink hard, trying to focus. The letters rearrange themselves. Remember what you promised. I don't remember making any promises. The second note was hidden inside a pillowcase. I almost missed it, might have missed it entirely if not for the way the fabric bunched differently on one side. The paper was smaller this time, torn from a larger sheet. Called in sick again. Can't explain the feeling that someone's been in my apartment. Nothing missing, but everything feels touched. Her supervisor confirmed this later, or maybe it was earlier. Time doesn't behave properly when you're trying to reconstruct someone else's last days. She'd been calling in sick frequently, claiming headaches, stomach problems, a persistent flu that never quite manifested symptoms anyone else could see. She seemed paranoid, the supervisor said. We met at a coffee shop downtown, though I can't recall who arranged the meeting. Always looking over her shoulder, jumping at small sounds. I wondered if she was having some kind of breakdown. But breakdowns don't explain the precision of that search. Someone had been looking for something specific, and they'd known where to look. The chaos was camouflage, meant to disguise purpose as random violence. I walk to my kitchen and pour water into a glass. The liquid is clear, tasteless, normal. Yet as I drink, I taste lavender. The flavor coats my tongue, lingers in my throat. I set the glass down with trembling fingers. The third note was the longest, folded small and hidden inside a book about local history. The binding was worn, pages soft from repeated handling. She'd been researching something, though what remained unclear. Found the records at the library. He wasn't who he claimed to be. None of them were. The building has a history, but not the one they tell. People have disappeared before. Always women, always alone. Below this, in different ink, he knows I know. The librarian remembered her. a thin woman with kind eyes and a habit of adjusting her glasses when nervous. She adjusted them frequently during our conversation. She came in almost daily near the end, always asking about property records, newspaper archives from decades past. She seemed to be tracking something, some pattern she discovered. Did she find what she was looking for? The glasses adjustment again. I think she found more than she wanted to. The building across from her apartment was old brick, unremarkable except for the corner windows that offered perfect views into her living space. I stood on the sidewalk one afternoon, looking up at the third floor. The window was dark, curtains drawn, but as I watched, I could swear I saw movement behind the fabric. Or maybe I wanted to see movement. Maybe I needed there to be someone watching, because the alternative was worse. The alternative was that she'd been afraid of shadows, that her fear had been groundless, that she disappeared for reasons having nothing to do with watchers in windows. But people don't just disappear. The photograph in my hand grows warm. Her smile seems different now, less calculated, more desperate. As if she'd known when the picture was taken that it might be the last image of her anyone would see. I find myself walking toward my own window, drawn by some invisible current. The street below is empty except for a single figure standing beneath a streetlight, too far away to make out features, but something about the posture seems familiar, patient, waiting. When I look again, the figure is gone. The fourth note was different from the others. Hastily written, words slanted as if her hand had been shaking. He's been in my apartment, I'm certain now. Small things moved. The perfume bottle turned slightly. A book I never opened lying face down on the table. He wants me to know he's been here. Below this, in letters so faint I almost missed them. I should have listened to the others. Others, this was the first mention of others. I spent days trying to decipher what she meant, who she might have been referring to. The building's rental history showed a pattern: single women, short tenancies, forwarding addresses that led nowhere. The property manager was a nervous man with sweaty palms and eyes that never quite met mine. He claimed not to remember specific tenants, said people moved frequently in that neighborhood, nothing unusual about short leases. Young women, they get spooked easy, he said, wiping his hands on his pants. City life isn't for everyone. But I saw how his gaze shifted when I mentioned her name, saw the way his fingers drummed against his desk, tapping out some anxious rhythm. The lavender scent fades suddenly, leaving me standing in my hallway with nothing but the memory of fragrance and a photograph that grows cooler in my palm. I look down at the image again. The woman's face stares back, but something has changed. The smile is gone now, replaced by an expression I can't quite read. Fear maybe, or recognition. I remember the last conversation I had about the case. Another detective, older than the first, with gray stubble and tired eyes. We met at his office, though the details of the room escape me now. Everything except his words. Sometimes people just want to start over. New city, new name, new life. It happens more than you'd think. But the notes, the fear, could have been written by anyone, could have been planted to throw us off track. People who want to disappear, they sometimes create false trails, makes it easier to slip away unnoticed. His explanation felt too neat, too convenient, like a door being closed on questions that deserved answers. But maybe that's what I needed to hear. Maybe I wanted to believe she'd chosen her own disappearance, that somewhere she was living safely under a different name. The alternative was darker. The alternative involved watchers in windows and patterns spanning decades and women who asked too many questions about things better left alone. I walk back to the kitchen and pour another glass of water. This time it tastes normal, clean, without any trace of lavender. But as I set the glass down, I notice something odd. The surface of the water continues to ripple long after I've stopped moving, as if disturbed by some invisible force. Or as if someone else is in the room with me. The final note was never found. I know it existed because she mentioned it in a phone call, her last known communication with anyone. The call went to her sister, a brief conversation recorded only in memory. I wrote it all down, everything I discovered. If something happens to me, look for the red notebook. I hid it where he'll never think to search. The red notebook was never found. Not in her apartment, not in her car, not in any of the places someone might think to hide something precious. It vanished along with her, leaving behind only questions and the lingering scent of lavender in rooms where it didn't belong. I turn the photograph over one final time. The writing on the back has changed again, though I know this is impossible. Now it reads, "Some promises are kept in silence." But I still don't remember making any promises. The building across from her apartment was demolished last month. I drove by one afternoon and found only empty space where brick and mortar used to stand. The corner window that once offered perfect views into her living space was gone, reduced to rubble and dust. Yet sometimes, late at night, I dream of standing at that window, looking down at the street below. In the dreams, I can see her apartment clearly, can watch her moving through rooms that should be dark and empty. She looks up sometimes, meets my gaze across the distance. Her expression is neither afraid nor accusatory. She looks relieved, as if she's been waiting for someone to finally understand. The photograph slips from my fingers and flutters to the floor. When I bend to retrieve it, the image has changed once more. Now it shows an empty room, curtains drawn, furniture covered in dust. No sign that anyone ever lived there at all. I straighten slowly, my back aching from the movement. The lavender scent returns, faint but unmistakable. It drifts through my apartment like a whisper, like a secret being shared in darkness. I follow it through rooms I know by heart, past furniture I've owned for years, toward spaces that should hold no mysteries. But the scent leads me to my closet, to clothes I rarely wear, to a box I don't remember storing there. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, I find a bottle of perfume, lavender with something sharper underneath. The label is faded, the bottle nearly empty. There's a note attached with a ribbon for when you're ready to remember. My hands shake as I set the bottle down. Memory shifts and rearranges itself, showing me fragments I'd forgotten or chosen not to see. A woman's voice on the phone, desperate and afraid. A promise made in darkness, words spoken in haste. An agreement to help, to investigate, to find the truth no matter where it led. But the truth led to places I wasn't prepared to go, to watchers in windows and patterns spanning decades, to questions that opened doors better left closed, to the understanding that some disappearances are chosen not by those who vanish, but by those who remain behind. The lavender scent grows stronger, filling my apartment with the weight of memory and guilt. I close my eyes and let it wash over me, let it carry me back to that final conversation, to promises made and broken, to the moment I chose safety over truth. She trusted me to find her. Instead, I learned to forget. The photograph lies on the floor between my feet, face down now, hiding whatever image it currently holds. I don't pick it up again. Some things are better left unseen, some truths better left unspoken. But the scent remains, clinging to my clothes, my hair, my skin. A reminder of promises kept in silence, of women who disappear not because they choose to, but because others choose to let them. I walk to the window and look down at the empty street. No figures wait beneath streetlights now. No watchers lurk in shadows. The night is quiet, peaceful, ordinary. Yet somewhere in the distance, carried on air that tastes of lavender and regret, I hear the echo of a woman's voice calling my name, asking me to remember, asking me to keep the promise I made in darkness, the one I've spent so long trying to forget. The sound fades as quickly as it came, leaving me alone with questions that have no answers and memories that shift like smoke. I turn away from the window, from the empty street, from the weight of what I know and what I've chosen not to know. But the scent follows me wherever I go, a ghost made of fragrance and guilt, reminding me that some disappearances are more complicated than they seem. That sometimes the people we're supposed to find are the ones we choose to lose. And sometimes, late at night when the world is quiet and dark, I wonder if she's still out there somewhere, waiting for someone to remember the promises they made, waiting for someone to finally tell her story. But that someone will never be me. The lavender fades to nothing, leaving only silence and the faint impression of secrets kept in darkness. I close my eyes and try to forget again, try to push the memories back into the spaces where they belong. Some things are better left buried, some truths are too dangerous to speak. Some promises are kept best in silence. Story 5. The door clicked softly, but it didn't open. My hand wavered, the weight of the metal unfamiliar, as if the key had been swapped in the night. The clock on the wall insisted it was morning, yet the gloom outside the window argued otherwise. Patterns in the wallpaper seemed to writhe, twisting into shapes that whispered of a different past. I traced a finger across the table, sensing dust where there should be none. The air hung heavy, carrying echoes of a song not yet sung. I reached for the handle once more, and the door swung wide, unexpectedly inviting. The brass feels warm beneath my palm now, always warm, even in winter. I remember thinking that was strange the first time I touched it, back when everything still made sense. Back when doors opened when they should and stayed closed when they shouldn't. The apartment hasn't changed. Same beige carpet with a stain near the window. Same kitchen counter with scratches forming an almost pattern. Same silence that presses against your eardrums until you hear things that aren't there. Or maybe they are there. I've stopped being certain about the difference. She lived here for 3 years. The landlord told me that, standing in the hallway with his keys jangling like wind chimes. 3 years and nobody really knew her name. Not her real one anyway. The mailbox said one thing, the lease said another, and the neighbors who bothered to notice called her something else entirely. I should explain why I'm here, why I keep coming back, but explanations require linear thinking, and linear thinking requires certainty, and certainty is something I lost somewhere between the 3rd interview and the 5th sleepless night. The case file sits on my kitchen table at home, thin, remarkably thin for a disappearance. Missing person reports should be thick, substantial. They should carry weight. This one feels hollow, like the pages might blow away if you breathed too hard on them. Her supervisor at the diner called it in. Tuesday morning, she didn't show up for her shift. Never missed a day before, not once. Reliable as clockwork, he said. Clockwork. I wrote that down, though I'm not sure why. Words have weight when you're grasping for patterns. The coffee cup still sits on the counter. I've seen it every time I've been here. Same position, same ring of dried coffee at the bottom. The forensics team photographed it, documented it, tested it. Nothing unusual, just coffee, just a cup, just another detail that refuses to fit into any meaningful shape. I remember asking the supervisor about her routine. He scratched his beard and looked past my shoulder when he answered. Always did that, looked past my shoulder, like he was seeing something behind me that I couldn't see. She'd come in at 6, he said, order the same breakfast every morning before her shift. 2 eggs, wheat toast, coffee black, sat at the corner booth, always the corner booth. Read something while she ate, never could tell what, kept the book close, private-like. Private-like, another phrase that stuck. I find myself thinking about privacy, about the spaces between what we show and what we hide, the gap between public faces and private truths. She lived in that gap, I think, existed in the space between one identity and another. The bedroom door stands ajar. I've never opened it fully. Something about the angle of it, the way it frames just a sliver of the room beyond, feels intentional. Like she positioned it that way on purpose. Like she knew someone would come looking and wanted to control what they'd see. Through the gap, a corner of the bed unmade, a window with curtains drawn, the edge of a dresser with something small and dark sitting on top. I've stared at that dark shape for hours, trying to determine what it is without crossing the threshold. A jewelry box, maybe, or a music box, or something else entirely. The neighbors, I should mention the neighbors. The woman upstairs with the nervous laugh who insisted she heard music at odd hours. Classical pieces played on repeat, the same measures over and over like someone learning to dance. The man next door who worked nights and slept days, who complained about footsteps in the hallway when the apartment should have been empty. Footsteps, I asked him, you're sure? He nodded, but his eyes held the same uncertainty I'd begun to recognize in my own reflection. Pretty sure. I thought so at the time, but you know how sounds carry in these old buildings. Could have been anything, I suppose. Could have been anything, the unofficial motto of this case. I found myself walking the hallway at different hours, listening. Old buildings do make sounds, pipes settling, wood expanding and contracting, the whisper of air through gaps in the walls. But sometimes, late at night when the building should be still, I hear what might be footsteps, or might be my own heartbeat, or might be the echo of footsteps from weeks ago, somehow trapped in the walls and released at random intervals. The bank records showed regular deposits from the diner, rent paid on time, always on time. No unusual purchases, no large withdrawals. Her financial life was as thin as her case file. Functional, minimal, like she was trying not to leave impressions. But there was one anomaly, a monthly payment to a storage facility across town. $50, same date every month, going back 2 years. I visited the facility, spoke to the manager. He remembered her, sort of. Quiet woman who paid in cash, always cash. Visited her unit irregularly, sometimes weekly, sometimes not for months. What did she keep there, I asked. He shrugged, never looked, not my business. She paid on time, caused no trouble, that's all I cared about. The unit was cleaned out after she disappeared. Standard procedure when rent goes unpaid. Contents sold at auction, records disposed of. Another dead end in a case that seemed constructed entirely of dead ends. I think about storage units sometimes, about the things we keep separate from our daily lives, the parts of ourselves we visit irregularly, like shrines to discarded identities. What did she store there? What pieces of herself did she need to keep at a distance? The wallpaper in the living room has a pattern, roses or something meant to be roses, faded pink against cream background, but in certain light, at certain angles, the roses look like faces. Not human faces exactly, something else. Something that might have been human once but got distorted in the translation from reality to pattern to perception. I've spent hours studying that wallpaper, tracing the repeating motifs with my finger, looking for variations, for breaks in the pattern that might mean something. The previous tenant mentioned it once, the wallpaper, said it gave her headaches, said she'd planned to replace it but never got around to it. Funny thing, she told me over the phone, sometimes I'd catch her just staring at it, the woman who lived there after me. She'd stand in the middle of the room and stare at the wall like she was reading something, like there were words hidden in the pattern. Words hidden in the pattern, I wrote that down too, added it to the growing collection of phrases that felt significant without being meaningful. The notebook where I keep these fragments is nearly full now. Pages and pages of disconnected observations, quotes taken out of context, descriptions of things that might or might not exist. Her personal effects were minimal. A few changes of clothes, all neutral colors, basic toiletries. No photographs, no letters, no books except for a small collection of poetry volumes with worn spines and pages marked by use. I read them looking for clues. The marked passages seemed random at first. Lines about transformation, about shedding skin, about becoming someone else, about the weight of names and the freedom of anonymity. One poem had a line circled in pencil. Identity is a costume we wear until we forget we're wearing it. I called the publisher, tried to trace when the book was purchased, where, by whom, another dead end. The book was a common edition, sold in dozens of bookstores. The pencil markings could have been made by anyone at any time, but something about the handwriting, the careful way the circle was drawn, suggested intention, suggested meaning. The diner where she worked has become a regular stop for me. I order the same breakfast she did, sit in the same booth. The supervisor has stopped looking past my shoulder when we talk. Now he looks directly at me, and I'm not sure which is worse. "You're becoming obsessed," he said last week. "I can see it in your eyes. Same look she had sometimes, like you're seeing something the rest of us can't see." Obsessed, maybe, but obsession implies irrationality, and I'm not sure this is irrational. Something happened to her. Something that left traces too subtle for standard investigation methods. Something that requires a different kind of attention. The coffee tastes different in her booth. Sharper, more bitter. Or maybe that's just my perception changing, adapting to the space she occupied. Maybe I'm absorbing her preferences, her habits, her way of experiencing the world. I found a receipt in the apartment, tucked between the pages of one of the poetry books. A small purchase from a shop I didn't recognize. Art supplies, charcoal pencils, sketch paper, fixative spray, but I never found any artwork in the apartment. No sketches, no drawings, no evidence of artistic activity. The shop owner remembered her when I described her, vaguely. She'd come in every few weeks, always bought the same things, always paid cash, never said much beyond the necessary pleasantries. "Did she ever mention what she was drawing?" I asked. "Never asked," he replied. "People buy art supplies for all kinds of reasons. Sometimes they're not ready to talk about their projects. Sometimes they never will be." Sometimes they never will be. Another phrase for the notebook. Another fragment of a picture I can't quite assemble. The apartment key grows warm in my pocket as I walk the halls. I've started carrying it with me everywhere, like a talisman, like a reminder of questions that refuse to be answered. The landlord doesn't know I still have it, probably assumes I returned it with the others after the initial investigation. But I need access to the space, need to sit in her silence, breathe her air, touch the surfaces she touched, need to understand what it felt like to live between identities, to exist in the gaps between one truth and another. The music box, I finally identified the dark shape on the dresser, saw it clearly when the afternoon light hit the bedroom at just the right angle. Small, wooden, with a tiny dancer frozen mid-pirouette. I haven't wounded it yet, haven't crossed the threshold to touch it, but I know it's there, waiting. Music boxes play the same song over and over. The same melody, the same rhythm, the same ending that loops back to the same beginning. Maybe that's what the upstairs neighbor heard. Maybe she would wind it and let it play, listening to the mechanical repetition of notes until they lost all meaning and became just sound, just noise, just the acoustic equivalent of wallpaper roses that might or might not be faces. I dream about the apartment sometimes. In the dreams, I'm living there, going through her routines, making coffee in the same cup, reading poetry at the kitchen table, staring at the wallpaper until the pattern starts to move. In the dreams, the bedroom door is always open, and I can see inside clearly. But when I wake up, I can never remember what I saw. The case remains officially open, inactive but open. There's no evidence of foul play, no signs of struggle, no indication of where she might have gone or why. People disappear sometimes, walk away from their lives, start over somewhere else, become someone new. It happens more often than we like to admit. But something about this disappearance feels different, intentional in a way that goes beyond simple escape. Like she didn't just leave her life behind, but carefully erased it piece by piece until only the faintest traces remained, until only the questions were left. I've started paying the storage unit fee, took over the monthly payment, kept the unit active. It's empty now, has been since the auction, but I needed to maintain that connection. Needed to preserve at least one piece of her routine, her pattern, her way of organizing the world into public and private spaces. Sometimes I sit in the empty unit and try to imagine what it contained, what parts of herself she stored there, what memories or artifacts or pieces of identity she needed to keep separate from her daily life. The concrete walls echo when I speak, and my voice sounds strange, distorted, like it's coming from someone else's throat. The poetry books remain on the kitchen table. I've read them all now multiple times. The marked passages start to form a kind of narrative when you read them in sequence. A story about transformation, about the fluid nature of identity, about the possibility of becoming someone entirely different while remaining fundamentally the same. One passage heavily underlined, "We are not who we were, nor who we will become, but something suspended between memory and possibility." Suspended between memory and possibility. That might be the most accurate description of this case I've found. Everything about her existence seems suspended, caught between what was and what might have been. Between presence and absence, between identity and anonymity, between the known and the unknowable. The wallpaper roses continue their dance between flower and face, between pattern and meaning. I've stopped trying to determine which interpretation is correct. Maybe they're both true simultaneously. Maybe truth itself is more fluid than we assume, more dependent on perspective and context and the particular quality of light at any given moment. The brass doorknob is warm again as I prepare to leave. Always warm, like it retains heat from every hand that has touched it. Like it remembers contact, stores the impression of fingers and palms and the particular pressure of someone turning it with purpose or hesitation or fear. I lock the door behind me, but I know I'll be back, tomorrow or next week or whenever the questions become too loud to ignore. The case file may be thin, but the mystery has weight. It pulls at me, draws me back to this place where someone lived between identities, where someone perfected the art of existing without leaving traces. The hallway is quiet as I walk toward the exit, but I think I hear footsteps behind me, matching my pace, echoing my rhythm. When I turn to look, the hallway is empty. Just shadows and silence, and the lingering sense that someone else was here is here, will always be here in the spaces between what we see and what we know. Outside, the city continues its relentless forward motion. People hurrying to appointments, to meetings, to lives that feel substantial and real and anchored in certainty. I envy them their solid ground, their clear destinations, their confidence in the difference between presence and absence. But I carry her mystery with me now. It's become part of my own identity, my own pattern of existence. I am the person who investigates disappearances that might not be disappearances, who looks for answers to questions that might not have answers, who sits in empty storage units and listens to the echo of my own voice asking why someone would choose to become no one. The notebook in my pocket grows heavier with each entry. Each fragment, each observation, each carefully recorded phrase that might mean everything or nothing. The weight of accumulated uncertainty, of questions that multiply instead of resolve, of a case that has become less about finding someone and more about understanding the nature of identity itself. She wanted to disappear and she succeeded, but in disappearing she created something else. A space shaped like a person, a mystery that breathes and grows and changes with each attempt to solve it. She may be gone, but her absence has presence. Her silence has voice. Her anonymity has identity. And I am the one who tends to that paradox, who maintains the vigil at the intersection of presence and absence, who keeps asking questions that have no answers because the questions themselves have become the answer. The mystery is not what happened to her. The mystery is what she became when she stopped being herself. The brass key grows warm in my pocket as I walk away, already planning my return. Story 6. I told them I was never there. It was late summer, the air heavy with the scent of cut grass and something faintly sour. My shoes carried a trace of mud, drying in uneven streaks. A few leaves, brittle and cracked, had lodged themselves in the treads like lost fingerprints. The curtains in the front room barely shifted, though the window was open just enough. Light pooled along the edges of the carpet, leaving shadows that should not exist. I felt the draft that shouldn't have been there, cold and misplaced. Yet the faint crunch beneath my feet seemed to disagree. The nausea comes first, it always does. A rolling sensation that starts somewhere behind my ribs and spreads outward like ripples in dark water. I've been carrying this feeling for weeks now, maybe longer. Time has become elastic, stretching and contracting in ways that make me question whether certain moments actually happened or if they're just echoes of something else entirely. I remember the weight of keys in my palm. Heavy, unfamiliar keys that seemed to know which door they belonged to before I did. The metal was warm, as if someone else had been holding them moments before. But that couldn't be right. I was alone. I'm always alone these days. The house breathed differently when I wasn't supposed to be there. Every creak of the floorboards felt amplified. Every whisper of air through the vents sounded like accusations. I found myself moving on instinct, navigating rooms I shouldn't have known, turning corners with a certainty that made my skin crawl. How did I know where the kitchen was? Why did my hand reach automatically for the light switch in that particular spot on the wall? There's a photograph on the mantelpiece that keeps changing. Sometimes it shows two people standing beside a car, their faces bleached out by overexposure. Other times it's a landscape, all rolling hills and empty sky. But when I try to focus on it directly, it becomes something else entirely. A mirror, perhaps, or just glass reflecting nothing at all. My therapist would say I'm dissociating. She uses that word like it explains everything, like it's a neat little box where all the messy parts of experience can be stored away. But dissociation doesn't account for the mud on my shoes or the way my clothes smelled like someone else's house. It doesn't explain why I woke up with scratches on my arms that I don't remember getting. The phone rang while I was standing in that kitchen I shouldn't have known. 3 short bursts, then silence. I didn't answer it. I couldn't. My hands were occupied with something else, something that felt important at the time, but now exists only as a vague impression of weight and texture. Glass, maybe, or ceramic, something fragile that demanded careful handling. I've been having dreams about doors. Endless corridors lined with identical doors, each one slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of rooms I might have been in before. In the dreams, I'm searching for something, but I can never remember what. I wake up with the taste of dust in my mouth and the sensation that I've been walking for hours. The detective asked me about my whereabouts, and I told him the truth. I was home. I was always home. But even as I said it, I could feel the lie settling into my bones like a chill. The truth has become negotiable, subject to interpretation and revision. What does it mean to be somewhere if you can't trust your own memory of being there? There was a moment standing in that front room with the impossible shadows when I felt completely outside of myself. I watched from somewhere near the ceiling as my body moved through the space with purpose and familiarity. My hands touched surfaces they shouldn't have recognized. My feet avoided creaky spots in the floor with practiced precision. It was like watching a stranger wear my skin, someone who knew things I had never learned. The sour smell keeps coming back to me, not just the memory of it, but the actual scent, drifting through my apartment at odd moments. I'll be making coffee or reading the newspaper, and suddenly the air will shift, carrying that same heavy sweetness tinged with decay. I check the garbage, the refrigerator, the corners where dampness might collect, but I never find the source. My mother used to tell me that houses remember everything that happens inside them. She said the walls absorb emotions like sponges, holding onto joy and sorrow with equal intensity. I used to think it was nonsense, the kind of mystical thinking that made me roll my eyes, but now I understand what she meant. Some places carry the weight of their own history, and stepping inside them is like walking into someone else's dream. The keys are gone now. I searched every pocket, every drawer, every surface where they might have been left, but they vanished as completely as if they never existed. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined them entirely, if the weight in my palm was just phantom sensation, the mind's way of filling in gaps where memory fails. But the mud was real. I scraped it from the soles of my shoes and examined it under the bathroom light. Dark earth mixed with something else, something that crumbled between my fingers like old mortar. There were tiny fragments embedded in it, too small to identify but sharp enough to catch the light. I flushed it all down the toilet and watched the water swirl brown before running clear again. The newspapers have been full of stories lately. Missing persons, unexplained disappearances, the usual catalog of small tragedies that make up the daily news. I read them with detached interest, the way you might study weather reports for places you'll never visit. But sometimes a detail will leap out at me, a description or location that feels familiar in a way I can't explain. There was an article about a house that had been standing empty for months. The neighbors complained about strange noises, lights appearing in windows that should have been dark. The police investigated but found no signs of forced entry, no evidence of squatters or vandalism. Just the lingering sense that someone had been there, moving through the rooms like a ghost. I cut out that article and kept it in my wallet for weeks. I would take it out and read it during quiet moments, searching for some hidden meaning in the sparse details. Eventually, the paper became soft and worn from handling, the ink beginning to smudge. I threw it away, but I can still recite every word from memory. The scratches on my arms have healed, leaving behind faint white lines like a map of somewhere I've never been. I trace them with my fingertips sometimes, trying to decode their pattern. They're too deliberate to be accidental, too random to be self-inflicted. At least, I think they are. The line between intention and accident has become blurred, like everything else in my life. My sleep has been fractured, broken into segments that don't quite connect. I'll wake up at odd hours with the sensation of having been somewhere else, of having conversations I can't quite remember. My sheets are often twisted and damp with sweat, as if I've been struggling against something in my dreams. But when I try to recall what I was dreaming about, I find only empty spaces where the memories should be. The draft in that front room bothered me more than it should have. Air shouldn't move like that in a closed space, shouldn't carry scents from rooms I hadn't visited yet. But it did, flowing around my ankles like invisible water, bringing with it the smell of dust and something else, something organic and unsettling. I've started avoiding certain streets in my neighborhood, taking longer routes that keep me away from houses that look too familiar. It's not a conscious decision, more like an instinct that steers me clear of places where I might have been before. My feet seem to know which sidewalks to avoid, which corners might trigger memories I'm not ready to confront. The feeling of being watched has become constant now, a prickle between my shoulder blades that never quite goes away. I check over my shoulder compulsively, scan faces in crowds for signs of recognition or suspicion. But I never see anything concrete, just the vague sense that I'm being observed and catalogued, filed away in someone else's memory. There are gaps in my day that I can't account for. I'll be sitting at my desk, working on something routine, and suddenly realize that hours have passed without my awareness. The work is always completed, my handwriting neat and familiar on the page, but I have no memory of doing it. It's as if someone else takes over during those lost periods, someone who shares my body but not my consciousness. The photograph on the mantelpiece was definitely of two people when I first saw it. A man and a woman standing beside what might have been a blue car, their faces obscured by shadows and overexposure. But when I looked again, it showed only the woman, standing alone in what appeared to be the same location. The space where the man had been wasn't empty exactly, more like it had been carefully erased, leaving behind a subtle distortion in the image. I've been thinking about the nature of presence lately, about what it means to occupy a space. If I was there but have no memory of being there, was I really present? Or is presence something more than just physical occupation, something that requires conscious awareness and intentional action? The philosophical implications make my head hurt, but I can't stop turning them over in my mind. The house had a particular smell that I recognize but can't place. Not just the sour sweetness I mentioned before, but something underneath it, something like old paper or dried flowers. It reminded me of my grandmother's attic, full of boxes and forgotten treasures, but sharper somehow, more immediate. I breathed it in deeply, trying to identify its components, but it slipped away like smoke. Sometimes I catch myself humming a tune I don't recognize, a simple melody that seems to come from nowhere. It's pleasant enough, almost hypnotic in its repetition, but it bothers me because I can't remember where I learned it. I've tried searching for it online, humming it into music recognition apps, but nothing comes up. It exists only in my memory, a ghost song with no origin or meaning. The detective's questions were routine, the kind of things they probably ask everyone in these situations. Where were you? Who were you with? Can anyone verify your whereabouts? I answered honestly, or as honestly as I could given the state of my memory. but I could see doubt in his eyes, the professional skepticism that comes from years of listening to people lie about their involvement in things they shouldn't have been involved in. My hands remember things my mind has forgotten. They know how to navigate unfamiliar spaces in the dark, how to open doors without making noise, how to move objects without leaving fingerprints. These skills feel foreign to me, like borrowed muscle memory from someone else's life, but they're undeniably mine, embedded in my nervous system like old habits I can't shake. The leaves in my shoe treads were from a tree I can't identify. I looked them up online, comparing their shape and texture to various species, but found no exact match. They were dried and brittle, as if they'd been pressed between pages of a book for years, but they crumbled to dust when I tried to remove them. The dust smelled like autumn, like the end of things. I've been wondering about the nature of guilt, about whether it's possible to feel responsible for something you don't remember doing. The weight in my chest suggests that it is, that the body keeps its own accounting system independent of conscious memory. I wake up each morning feeling like I owe a debt I can't name to people I can't identify. The window in that front room was open just a crack, maybe an inch or two, but it felt significant somehow, like a mouth slightly parted, ready to speak or swallow. The curtains moved with a rhythm that didn't match the breeze outside, as if the house itself was breathing. I stood there for a long time, watching that subtle movement, trying to understand what it meant. There are moments when I feel like I'm living someone else's life, wearing their memories like ill-fitting clothes. The sensation is strongest when I'm doing routine things, brushing my teeth or making breakfast, and suddenly nothing feels familiar. The face in the mirror looks wrong, the movements of my hands seem foreign, the taste of food becomes strange and unpleasant. The mud has appeared on my shoes twice more since that first incident. Each time I have no memory of going anywhere that would explain its presence. I've started checking my shoes compulsively before bed and first thing in the morning, looking for evidence of journeys I don't remember taking. The ritual has become as important as brushing my teeth, a way of monitoring my own reliability as a witness to my own life. Sometimes I think about calling the detective back, telling him about the gaps in my memory, the mud, the keys that appeared and disappeared. But what would I say? That I might have been somewhere I wasn't supposed to be, doing something I can't remember. That my own mind has become unreliable, subject to blackouts and false memories. It would only confirm his suspicions without providing any useful information. The house is probably empty again now, returned to its state of patient waiting. The photograph on the mantelpiece continues its slow metamorphosis, cycling through images that may or may not have ever existed. The front room breathes its impossible drafts, carrying scents from rooms that might be real or might be figments of collective imagination. And somewhere pressed into the carpet fibers are the traces of footsteps that may or may not have been mine. I told them I was never there, and in the most important sense, that might be true. The person who walked through those rooms, who knew which doors to open and which shadows to avoid, might have been someone else entirely. Someone who borrowed my body for a few hours and left behind only fragments of evidence and the persistent taste of guilt. The nausea remains, rolling through me in waves that correspond to no physical cause I can identify. It's become my constant companion, a reminder of something I can't quite remember but can't entirely forget. And in the quiet moments between sleep and waking, I sometimes hear the echo of that crunch beneath my feet, the sound of leaves breaking apart like tiny bones, like the last remnants of certainty crumbling into dust. Story 7. I always counted the steps, a mindless routine as I climbed the wooden staircase each morning. 12 creaky steps, 10 with a slight protest, and 2 that stayed silent. Each day it seemed like nothing could change until the 10th step began to falter. First it creaked a bit louder, and then, just yesterday, it skipped its usual groan entirely, like it was holding back. It could be the woods settling, I told myself. Today, though, there was a whisper of something else, a faint scuffing. And the 12th step didn't make a sound. The smell comes back to me in fragments, something sweet, cloying, like flowers left too long in water, their stems turning brown and soft. I remember standing at the top of those stairs, looking down, trying to place that smell. It wasn't coming from the kitchen, wasn't coming from anywhere I could name. My hand on the banister, the wood smooth under my palm, worn by countless hands before mine, but there was something else, a stickiness, barely there, just enough to make my fingers hesitate before letting go. I think I called out. Did I call out? The words feel strange in my mouth now, like speaking a language I used to know. Hello, maybe, or maybe I just thought about calling out. The house swallowed sounds differently then. Rooms that used to echo seemed muffled, carpeted in silence. The pattern changed. That's what I keep coming back to, not just the steps, but everything. The way light fell through the windows, the way doors sat in their frames, slightly more open or closed than before. Small things, things you might not notice unless you lived with them every single day. I found myself avoiding the stairs some mornings, taking the long way around through the back entrance, telling myself it was for variety, for the exercise, but my feet knew better. They'd slow down near that staircase, like approaching something sleeping that shouldn't be woken. There were voices, not loud ones, whispers that might have been the house settling, might have been pipes, might have been my own breathing echoing back at me. But I started listening for them, started pausing at the bottom of those 12 steps, head tilted, waiting. Did you hear that? I remember asking, but asking who? The room was empty, had been empty, was supposed to be empty. The 10th step started sinking, just slightly, like the wood was softening beneath repeated weight. I pressed my foot down, testing, and felt it give way just a fraction more than it should. The house was old. These things happen in old houses. Foundations settle, wood warps, perfectly normal. But perfectly normal doesn't explain why I started counting my own footsteps everywhere else. In the hallway, across the kitchen floor, down the front walk, 12 became a number that followed me, tapping at the edge of my thoughts. I remember dust motes in afternoon light, the way they swirled in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, like someone had just walked through them. Like the air was still disturbed by movement I hadn't seen. I'd stand there watching those tiny particles dance and resettle, trying to read meaning in their choreography. The smell grew stronger, sweeter. I followed it once, nose lifted like an animal tracking prey, up the 12 steps, across the landing, down the narrow hallway, but it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, from the walls themselves maybe, from spaces between spaces. My reflection in the hallway mirror looked different, not older, not changed in any way I could name, just different, like seeing a photograph of myself taken by someone else from an angle I'd never chosen. I started avoiding that mirror, keeping my eyes down when I passed. "You're being ridiculous," I told the empty house, but the house didn't answer. Houses don't answer, except sometimes in the space between words I thought I heard something that might have been agreement, or might have been warning. The 12th step went completely silent, not just quiet, but silent in a way that felt intentional, like it was holding its breath. I'd pause there, balanced on that last step, listening to the quality of that silence. It had weight to it, substance. I started leaving things in different places. Small things, a coffee cup on the counter instead of in the sink, a book face down instead of closed, testing, seeing if the house would notice, if someone would notice. And things moved, not dramatically. not in ways I could point to and say definitively that they'd been disturbed, but shifted, rotated slightly, pushed an inch to the left or right, the kind of changes that make you question your own memory, your own careful habits. There were more sounds at night. Settling, I told myself. Old houses settle, but settling doesn't usually sound like footsteps, doesn't usually follow patterns, doesn't usually pause outside bedroom doors as if listening. I started sleeping with my door closed, then locked, then with a chair pushed against it just in case of what I couldn't say, in case the lock decided to stop working, in case doors decided to open themselves. The sweet smell was strongest in the morning, right after climbing those 12 steps, like it had been building all night in the closed spaces, concentrating itself for my arrival. I'd breathe through my mouth, but taste still has a way of finding you. I remember fragments of conversation, my own voice mostly, questions asked to empty rooms. Is someone there? What do you want? Why won't you just tell me? But the other half of those conversations, the answers, slip away from me, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. The pattern of the steps changed again. Now it was the 9th that stayed silent, while the 10th resumed its familiar creak, as if something was learning, adapting, finding new ways to make itself known without being too obvious about it. I started documenting things, writing down which steps made noise and which didn't, mapping the movement of objects, tracking the intensity of that sweet, cloying smell. But my notes contradicted themselves. What I wrote down in the morning didn't match what I remembered by evening. Memory is unreliable, I told myself, but unreliable doesn't explain why some memories felt more real than others, why some moments seemed to have extra weight, extra clarity, like they'd been highlighted in my mind by someone else's hand. The house felt smaller, rooms that used to be spacious seemed cramped, hallways that used to be wide felt narrow, as if the walls were slowly, imperceptibly closing in, or as if there was less empty space than there used to be, as if something was taking up room without being visible. I found myself talking to the house more often, not crazy talk, just commentary, going upstairs now, turning off the lights, heading to bed, like providing a narration for an invisible audience, like keeping someone informed of my movements. And sometimes, in the pause after speaking, I thought I heard acknowledgement, a sigh, a settling, a sound that might have been satisfaction. The 12th step developed a hollow sound, not silent anymore, but hollow, like stepping on something that wasn't quite solid, like there was space beneath it that hadn't been there before. I'd tapped my foot against it, testing, but it held my weight just fine. I remember standing at the top of those stairs, looking down, trying to remember what I'd been afraid of. The fear felt distant, like a story someone had told me about someone else, but the steps still counted themselves in my head, still marked their familiar rhythm. 1 through 11, each with its own voice, and 12 hollow and waiting at the top. The smell comes back to me now, sitting here, trying to piece together what I remember and what I think I remember. Sweet flowers in stagnant water, something beautiful that stayed too long and started to change. I always counted the steps, still do, even when I'm not climbing them. Even when I'm nowhere near that staircase. 12 steps that taught me the difference between empty and vacant, between alone and solitary. Between a house that's waiting for someone to come home and a house where someone never left. Story 8. It wasn't unusual for the curtains to be drawn a little too tight. They hadn't been washed in a while, thin layers of dust resting on the folds. I usually dusted the window ledge. I liked seeing the clear line between clean wood and smudged glass. The lock on the window hadn't been turned in weeks, sticking just enough to make you notice. On most mornings, I would sit by the window with my coffee, sipping slowly, watching the world from a distance, but I never opened it, not really. The air moved just fine without it. The smell comes back first, always the smell, something sweet mixed with something else I can't place, like flowers left too long in water or fruit that's just turned. It clings to the inside of my nose even now when I'm trying to remember why I stopped opening that window. I was cleaning that morning. I think I was cleaning. The cloth in my hand was damp and there were streaks on the glass where I'd been wiping in circles, round and round, the same motion. My mother used to tell me to wipe in straight lines, but I never listened. Circles felt more natural, more complete somehow. The phone rang, or maybe it didn't. Sometimes I think I remember the sound, but when I really focus, there's just silence. Just me and the cloth in the window that wouldn't open properly. The lock was stuck, I told myself. That's why I never tried very hard. There was someone in the yard next door. I could see the shape through the dusty glass moving between the trees. Slow, deliberate movements, like they were looking for something they'd dropped or buried. I pressed my face closer to the window, my breath fogging the clean spots I'd just made. The figure stopped, turned. For just a moment I thought they were looking right at me, but that's impossible. The curtains were drawn too tight. Nobody could see in. Nobody ever could. I stepped back from the window. The floorboard creaked under my foot, the same board that always creaked, the one I usually remembered to avoid. But my mind was somewhere else, trying to catch hold of something that kept slipping away. There was a conversation. I'm almost sure there was a conversation. Voices in the kitchen, maybe, or the hallway. Low and urgent, the kind of talking people do when they don't want to be overheard. I can almost hear the words, but they dissolve before I can make sense of them. "You can't keep pretending," someone said, or maybe I said it. The voice sounds like mine sometimes when I play it back in my head. Other times it sounds like a stranger. The cleaning cloth was still in my hand. I must have been holding it for a long time because my fingers had gone numb. When I looked down, it wasn't damp anymore. It was completely dry, as if I'd imagined the whole thing. But the window was clean, cleaner than it had been in months. I could see through it perfectly now, every detail of the yard next door sharp and clear. The figure was gone. Had there ever been a figure at all? I tried the window lock just to see, just to test if it really was stuck like I'd been telling myself. It turned easily, smoothly, like it had been oiled recently. The window slid open without any resistance at all. The smell rushed in immediately. That sweet, turned smell that had been living in my memory. It was stronger now, more complex. There were layers to it I hadn't noticed before. Something green and growing underneath the sweetness. Something that reminded me of the basement after heavy rain. I closed the window quickly, too quickly. The slam echoed through the house, and I realized how quiet everything had been before, how still, like the house had been holding its breath. The yard next door looked different with the window closed again. Smaller somehow, less significant, just grass and trees and the normal shadows that belonged there. Nothing suspicious, nothing worth watching. But I kept watching anyway. There were other mornings. I think there were other mornings. The routine was always the same. Coffee, window, cleaning cloth, the circles on the glass, the figure in the yard that might have been there, might not have been, the conversations I couldn't quite remember having. Sometimes the phone really did ring. I would let it ring and ring, counting the sounds until they stopped. 12 rings usually, always 12, like whoever was calling knew exactly how long to wait before giving up. "You should answer it," the voice said. My voice, someone's voice, but I never did. The curtains grew dustier. I stopped cleaning them, stopped caring about the clear line between clean wood and smudged glass. The window ledge collected dust and dead insects and small things I didn't want to identify. The lock remained untouched. But I could still smell it, that sweet, complex smell that seemed to seep through the glass even when the window was closed tight. It was getting stronger, or maybe I was getting more sensitive to it. Either way, it was becoming harder to ignore. I started avoiding that room. The room with the window, the curtains, the smell. I moved my morning coffee routine to the kitchen table, where I could sit with my back to everything and pretend the window didn't exist. It didn't help the smell followed me, or maybe I carried it with me. Maybe it had soaked into my clothes, my hair, my skin. Maybe it had been there all along and I was just now noticing. The cleaning cloth appeared in my hand again. I don't remember picking it up. I don't remember walking back to that room. But there I was, standing in front of the window, ready to wipe away whatever I could see. The yard next door had changed. The grass was longer, wilder. The trees seemed closer to the fence, their branches reaching toward my window like fingers. And there, in the space between the oak tree and the garden shed, was a patch of ground that looked different from the rest. Darker, softer, recently disturbed. I pressed the cloth against the glass, wiping in circles, trying to see more clearly. The figure was back, standing at the edge of that dark patch, not moving this time, just standing, facing my window. Facing me. I dropped the cloth. It fell silently to the floor, landing on the same creaky board that always gave me away. But this time I didn't step back. I couldn't. I was frozen there, staring through the clean glass at the figure who was staring back. The phone rang 12 times. I counted every ring, but I didn't move, couldn't move. The figure didn't move either. We were locked in some kind of standoff, separated by glass and dust and all the things I couldn't quite remember. When the ringing stopped, the figure raised one hand. A wave, a greeting, a goodbye, I couldn't tell which. Then they turned and walked toward the dark patch of ground, walked to it, around it, over it. Their footsteps left no impression in the soft earth. They cast no shadow in the morning light. I understood then, in that moment of perfect clarity, why I had stopped opening the window, why the curtains stayed drawn, why the smell never went away no matter how much I cleaned or how far I tried to run from it. The figure wasn't in the yard next door. The figure was in the reflection. I picked up the cloth from the creaky floorboard. My hands were steady now, purposeful. I began wiping the window again, making slow, careful circles. The glass grew cleaner with each pass, more transparent. The view became sharper, more detailed. And the smell grew stronger. I can smell it now as I sit here trying to piece together what happened, what I saw, what I've been running from all this time. The sweet, turned smell that might be flowers or fruit or something else entirely. Something that's been waiting patiently behind drawn curtains and locked windows and all the small lies I tell myself about what I can and cannot see. The cloth is still in my hand. The window is still there, waiting. And somewhere in the space between memory and truth, the figure is still standing in that dark patch of ground, still waving, still watching. Still waiting for me to remember why I stopped opening the window in the first place. The curtains are drawn a little too tight again. They haven't been washed in a while, thin layers of dust resting on the folds, but I can see through them now if I look hard enough. I can see everything I tried so hard to forget. And it can see me too, Story 9. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains, casting intricate patterns on the wooden floorboards. The quiet hum of a distant lawnmower was the only intrusion in the tranquil room. Everything seemed untouched since last night, except for the grandfather clock, its pendulum frozen mid-swing. It was then I noticed the faint scent of sea salt in the air, an impossible detail miles from the ocean, hinting at a secret that refused to stay buried. I run my fingers along the clock's mahogany frame, feeling the grain beneath my fingertips. The wood is cold despite the morning warmth seeping through the windows. Something about this stillness pulls me back not to yesterday, but to months ago. Or was it longer? Time has become fluid since I started following the threads of what happened here. The salt smell grows stronger when I close my eyes. She was sitting in that same chair by the window when I first interviewed her, the witness, her hands folded in her lap, perfectly still, like someone posing for a portrait. I remember thinking how composed she seemed for someone who claimed to have seen what she saw. He came through the front door, she had told me, just walked right in like he belonged here. But there were no signs of forced entry. The lock was intact, the door frame unmarked. I wrote this down in my notebook, the same notebook that now sits on my desk with pages that seem to contradict themselves every time I read them. The scent fades when I open my eyes again. I was a different person then, more certain. I believed in evidence, in logical progression from question to answer. The case seemed straightforward at first, a missing person, last seen in this very room. The family had called when he didn't return home. Standard procedure. Canvass the neighborhood, interview potential witnesses, follow the timeline. Except the timeline never quite aligned. The woman in the chair, I can see her so clearly, yet her face remains somehow indistinct in my memory. She wore a blue sweater, or was it gray? The details shift when I try to pin them down, like looking at something through water. "Did you know him well?" I had asked. "Well enough," she replied. "He had a way of making himself known." I flip through my notebook now, searching for that exact quote. The pages are filled with my handwriting, but the words seem different each time. Did she say well enough or not well? Did she mention the blue car in the driveway, or did I imagine that detail? The grandfather clock ticks once, startling me, then silence again. There was another witness, a neighbor who lived across the street. He claimed to have seen someone leaving through the back door around the time in question. But when I returned to interview him a second time, his story had changed. Small details, at first the time shifted by an hour, the description of clothing altered slightly, then larger inconsistencies emerged. "I might have been mistaken about the door," he said during our third conversation. "Could have been the side window." The house has no side window. I stand in the center of the room now, trying to recreate that first day. The furniture was arranged differently then. The sofa faced the other direction. The coffee table held a newspaper folded to the crossword puzzle, half completed. Someone had written salt in 7 across. The clue was tears, essentially. The newspaper is gone now. I've searched everywhere for it, but physical evidence has a way of disappearing in this case. Photographs become blurry. Documents misfile themselves. Witnesses develop sudden lapses in memory. But the salt smell returns. I remember driving home that first night, convinced I was close to solving everything. The missing person had clearly left voluntarily. The evidence suggested a planned departure rather than foul play. People disappear by choice more often than we care to admit. Sometimes the simple explanation is the correct one. Yet something nagged at me, a sensation I couldn't name. The woman in the blue sweater had mentioned a phone call. Someone had called the house the morning he disappeared. She answered but heard only breathing on the other end. When she asked who was calling, the line went dead. "Probably nothing," she said. "We get those sometimes." But the phone records showed no incoming calls that morning, no incoming calls for 3 days prior. The phone company double-checked their logs at my request. Nothing. I asked her about this discrepancy during my second visit. She looked genuinely confused. "I'm certain the phone rang," she insisted. "I remember walking across the room to answer it." The phone sat on a table beside her chair. She wouldn't have needed to walk anywhere. My supervisor suggested I was overthinking the case. Missing persons investigations often contain loose ends that never tie together neatly. People lie or misremember. Witnesses contradict themselves. The important thing was determining whether a crime had been committed. No evidence of violence, no signs of struggle, no indication of foul play. Case closed. But I kept returning to the house. The current owner's distant relatives who inherited the property gave me permission to walk through occasionally. They found my continued interest somewhat odd but harmless. I told them I was writing a report. I told them I wanted to ensure nothing had been overlooked. I told them many things, I'm not sure which were true. The grandfather clock stopped working after my fourth visit. The owners mentioned it casually when I arrived one morning. They'd been meaning to have it repaired, they said, but hadn't found the time. It had been keeping perfect time for decades. "Strange how these old things just give up," the woman said. She was much younger than the previous witness, with dark hair and nervous energy. One day it's ticking along fine, the next day nothing. I examined the clock mechanism. No obvious damage. The weights hung properly. The pendulum moved freely when pushed, yet it refused to maintain its rhythm. "When did it stop exactly?" I asked. She thought for a moment. "Tuesday, I think, or maybe Wednesday. Time blurs together when you're not working." But I had been here on Tuesday. I had been standing in this exact spot when I first noticed the salt scent. The clock had been running then. I was certain of it. Wasn't I? The missing person's name was in my files, but I find myself unable to recall it clearly. This troubles me more than I care to admit. I've handled hundreds of cases over the years. Names and faces usually stick, especially in unsolved matters, but his identity seems to slip away whenever I try to focus on it. I remember his height approximately, his age roughly, his hair color in general terms, but the specifics dissolve under scrutiny. The woman in the blue sweater had described him in detail. I have her statement in my notebook, yet when I read her words now, they seem to describe someone different each time. The height changes, the hair color shifts, the age fluctuates. "He was the kind of person you notice," she had said, "but also the kind you forget." This contradiction made no sense then. It makes less sense now. I've started making lists, details that remain consistent between visits, details that change, details that disappear entirely. The exercise should bring clarity, but instead reveals how unreliable my own observations have become. The salt scent appears on my list under all three categories. Sometimes it's barely detectable. Other times it fills the room so completely I can taste it. Occasionally it's absent altogether, leaving me to wonder if I imagined it from the beginning. Salt preserves things, it keeps them from decay, but it also corrodes, eating away at metal and stone given enough time. I think about this contradiction often now. The neighbor across the street moved away without leaving a forwarding address. The house went up for sale suddenly. I drove by one morning to find a sold sign already posted in the yard. The transaction happened quickly, too quickly for normal real estate procedures. I tried to contact him through his previous employer. They had no record of anyone by that name ever working there. I checked the city directory. His name appeared for 1 year only, then vanished from subsequent editions. People don't simply disappear from official records. There are always traces, paper trails, digital footprints, some evidence of existence. But apparently some people do disappear. The new neighbors are a young couple with twin babies. They keep to themselves mostly. I've spoken to them briefly during my visits to the house across the street. They seem pleasant enough, though they've never heard of the previous occupant. The house was empty when we bought it, the husband told me. Had been vacant for months, according to the realtor. This contradicts the timeline I've constructed. The previous neighbor was living there when the disappearance occurred. I interviewed him multiple times over several weeks. He couldn't have moved out months before events I clearly remember happening recently. Time has become unreliable in this case. Events I remember as recent feel distant when I examine them closely. Details I recorded weeks ago seem to have been written years earlier. My handwriting changes subtly throughout the notebook, as if different versions of myself made the entries. The missing person's family stopped returning my calls. I understand their frustration. Months have passed without progress. They need to move forward with their lives. Closure comes in many forms, and sometimes acceptance of uncertainty is the only resolution possible. But I can't let go. The salt scent has followed me home. I smell it in my kitchen when I'm making coffee, in my bedroom when I'm trying to sleep, in my car during the drive to work. It's faint but persistent, like a memory that won't fade. I've checked my house for possible sources. No salt residue anywhere, no ocean-scented candles or air fresheners, no logical explanation for the smell. My partner suggested I take some time off. The case has consumed more of my attention than departmental policy typically allows. There are other investigations requiring focus, other families waiting for answers. Sometimes you have to accept that not every mystery gets solved, she said. Some questions don't have answers. But every question has an answer. The answer might be unknowable or unacceptable, but it exists somewhere in the space between what happened and what we remember happening. I returned to the house yesterday, or was it last week? The distinction seems less important now. The current owners weren't home, but they'd given me a key months ago. I let myself in and stood in the front room, breathing deeply. The salt scent was stronger than ever. I walked through each room systematically, searching for something I couldn't name. The bedrooms held nothing unusual. The kitchen appeared normal. The basement was empty except for a water heater and some storage boxes. But in the closet beneath the stairs, I found something interesting. A small wooden box, roughly the size of a jewelry case. It wasn't hidden exactly, just placed on a shelf behind some old coats. The wood was weathered, as if it had been exposed to salt air for years. Inside the box was a collection of items that seemed random at first glance. A brass button from a coat, a ticket stub from some unnamed event, a photograph so faded the subjects were barely visible, a small vial filled with what looked like sand. More salt, I held the vial up to the light. The crystals were too uniform to be sand, too coarse to be table salt. Sea salt, perhaps, the kind that forms naturally when ocean water evaporates. But we're hundreds of miles from the ocean. The photograph showed two figures standing beside what might have been a pier or dock. The image was too degraded to make out faces or specific details. One figure appeared taller than the other. Both were wearing dark clothing. I turned the photograph over. Someone had written something on the back in pencil, but the words were too faded to read clearly. I could make out a few letters, R and M, and what might have been one or I. The ticket stub was similarly degraded. I could see it had been torn from a larger ticket, but the printing was illegible. It felt old, brittle between my fingers. The brass button was the most intriguing item. It was larger than typical clothing buttons, with an anchor design embossed on the surface. Military perhaps, or maritime. The brass had tarnished to a green patina that suggested age and exposure to salt air. I sat in the closet for a long time, holding these objects and trying to understand their significance. They felt important, though I couldn't articulate why. Connected to the disappearance somehow, though the connection remained unclear. The salt scent was overwhelming now. When I finally emerged from the closet, the grandfather clock was ticking again. The sound filled the house with steady rhythm, as if time itself had resumed after a long pause. I checked my watch. 3 hours had passed since I entered the house. It felt like minutes. The woman in the blue sweater was sitting in her chair by the window. I blinked hard and looked again. The chair was empty, of course. Sunlight streamed through the lace curtains, casting the same intricate patterns on the wooden floor, but for just a moment I had seen her clearly, more clearly than in any of my actual interviews. She was younger than I remembered. Her hair was different. The blue sweater was actually gray. "You found them," she said, though her lips didn't move. I looked down at the wooden box in my hands. The objects inside seemed to glow faintly in the afternoon light. "What are they?" I asked the empty room. No answer came, but I understood anyway. These were pieces of a life that had ended not with disappearance, but with transformation. The missing person hadn't vanished, he had become something else, someone else. The salt had preserved him while simultaneously dissolving his former identity. The realization should have brought satisfaction. Instead, it opened new questions that felt even more unanswerable than the original mystery. Who was he before he became who he was? Where had the salt come from? Why could only I smell it? What did the woman in the blue sweater know that she couldn't or wouldn't tell me? I placed the wooden box back on the shelf and left the house. The grandfather clock continued ticking behind me, marking time that moved in directions I couldn't follow. The case remains officially closed. The missing person is still missing, though I suspect he was never really there to begin with. The witnesses have scattered or changed their stories so many times that their testimony has become meaningless. The evidence has degraded beyond usefulness. But I still smell the salt. It's with me now as I write this report that will never be filed. It surrounds me like an invisible ocean, vast and deep and full of currents I can't navigate. Sometimes I think I'm drowning in it. Other times I feel it might be the only thing keeping me afloat. The truth is somewhere in that scent, hidden in the space between memory and reality, between what happened and what I think happened, between who disappeared and who remains. I may never find it, but I can't stop looking. The salt preserves everything, including the questions that have no answers. Story 10. It wasn't unusual for the lights to flicker in the hallway. The wiring in old buildings had a way of doing that, shifting slightly as if alive. I didn't pay much attention when the bulbs dimmed at odd intervals. Someone might have changed one recently, but I never noticed who. Once I saw a door ajar down the corridor, but it seemed locked when I checked later. The floor tiles felt colder than usual, though only in certain spots. My footsteps barely made a sound there. When I walked past the empty room at the end, I didn't look inside. There was no reason to check at that hour. The coffee cup sits on my desk now, its rim stained with lipstick that isn't mine. I remember buying it from the vending machine, but the taste was different that morning. Sweeter. Someone had added something, though I couldn't identify what. The ceramic felt warm in my hands long after I'd finished drinking, as if it retained heat from another source entirely. I kept it because throwing it away seemed wrong somehow. The stain has darkened over time, becoming more pronounced rather than fading. Sometimes I catch myself staring at it, wondering whose mouth had touched that edge before mine. The elevator button was sticky when I pressed it. Third floor, always third floor, but my finger came away with something tacky and dark. I wiped it on my jacket without thinking, leaving a small mark that looked like rust or dried paint. The elevator hummed differently that day, a lower pitch that made my teeth ache. Between the second and third floors, it lurched slightly, as if something heavy had shifted in the shaft above us. The doors opened with their usual mechanical wheeze, but the sound echoed longer than normal in the empty corridor beyond. Her perfume lingered in the stairwell for weeks afterward, something floral and expensive, too sophisticated for someone who worked in filing. I'd smelled it before in the supply closet, mixed with the sharp scent of toner and paper dust. It clung to certain documents, making them easy to identify even with my eyes closed. The fragrance seemed to follow me home some evenings, settling into my clothes and hair like smoke. I started taking different routes, but the smell appeared in unexpected places. The grocery store, my car, even my apartment bathroom. It was strongest near mirrors, as if someone wearing it had stood very close to each reflection. The telephone rang at odd intervals, always when I was alone in the office. 7 rings, then silence. If I answered quickly enough, I could hear breathing on the other end, steady and patient. The caller never spoke, but sometimes there were background sounds, typing, pages turning, the distant hum of fluorescent lights. Once I heard my own voice, faint and distorted, as if someone were playing back a recording from another room. I started letting the calls go to voicemail, but the machine never captured anything. The red light would blink, indicating a message, but when I played it back, there was only static. The security camera in the corner had been repositioned. I noticed because the angle was wrong, pointing toward the water cooler instead of the main entrance. The red recording light still blinked steadily, but I wondered what it was actually capturing. I asked about it during a staff meeting, but everyone seemed confused by the question. They insisted it had always pointed in that direction. I checked the maintenance logs, but there were no entries about camera adjustments. The lens looked clean, recently wiped, though no one admitted to cleaning it. My desk drawer stuck when I tried to open it. Something was wedged in the back, behind the usual clutter of pens and paper clips. I reached blindly and felt smooth paper folded multiple times into a small square. When I unfolded it, I found a photocopy of my employee ID, but the picture was wrong. The face looked like mine, but older, with shadows under the eyes that I didn't remember having when the original photo was taken. The background was different too, showing part of a room I'd never seen before. I compared it to the ID in my wallet, but that one looked normal. I kept the photocopy in my pocket, checking it periodically to see if it had changed back. The water cooler bubbled constantly, even when no one was drawing from it. The sound reminded me of someone drowning or trying to speak underwater. I avoided drinking from it after I noticed the strange taste, metallic and slightly warm despite the cooling system. The 5-gallon bottle on top was always nearly empty, though I rarely saw anyone refilling it. Condensation formed unusual patterns on the plastic, like fingerprints or words written in an unfamiliar language. The drip tray underneath overflowed regularly, creating small puddles that no one ever cleaned up. The filing cabinet in the corner was locked, but I found the key taped under my desk chair. Inside were folders with my name on them, filled with documents I didn't recognize. Performance reviews I'd never seen, signed by supervisors I couldn't place. Medical forms with details that seemed accurate but weren't from my doctor. A lease agreement for an apartment I'd never lived in, with my signature at the bottom in handwriting that looked almost like mine but not quite. Each folder was organized chronologically, spanning years of a life that paralleled mine but diverged in small, significant ways. The window blinds were always adjusted to the same position when I arrived each morning, regardless of how I'd left them the evening before. Someone was entering the office overnight, making subtle changes. The slats filtered sunlight into precise geometric patterns on the floor, creating shadows that moved throughout the day like a sundial. I started marking the blind cords with tiny pen marks to test my theory, but the marks disappeared by morning, and the blinds remained in their predetermined position. The air conditioning vent above my workstation rattled with a rhythm that sounded almost like Morse code. I tried to decode it once, writing down the pattern of long and short vibrations, but the message was incomplete or in a language I didn't understand. The vent cover was loose, held by only 2 screws instead of 4. When I stood on my chair to investigate, I could see into the ductwork. There were scratches in the metal, as if someone had crawled through recently. A few strands of hair were caught on the sharp edges, too long to be mine and the wrong color. The bathroom mirror reflected things that weren't quite there. I'd catch movement in the peripheral vision of my reflection, but when I turned to look directly, nothing was behind me. The fluorescent light above it flickered in the same pattern as the hallway lights, creating a strobe effect that made my face look unfamiliar. Sometimes I appeared younger in the reflection, sometimes older, as if the mirror were showing me different versions of myself from different times. I started avoiding eye contact with my own reflection, focusing instead on washing my hands or adjusting my clothes. The parking lot security light cast my car's shadow in the wrong direction. Based on the position of the sun, the shadow should have fallen toward the east, but it stretched westward instead, as if the light source was coming from somewhere else entirely. Other cars cast normal shadows, following the expected physics of illumination. Only mine seemed to defy the natural order. I moved to different parking spaces, but the phenomenon persisted. The shadow was always too long, too dark, and pointed toward the building instead of away from it. The break room microwave retained the smell of food I'd never heated, curry and garlic, strong enough to make my eyes water when I opened the door. The turntable was always positioned at the same angle with a specific section facing forward. I cleaned it thoroughly with bleach and disinfectant, but the smell returned within hours. The digital clock on the front ran several minutes fast, though I reset it repeatedly. Sometimes I found it unplugged in the morning, though I was certain I'd left it connected the night before. My computer mouse moved slightly between sessions, always positioned at a different angle on the mousepad. The scroll wheel was warm to the touch, as if someone had been using it recently. Browser history showed searches I hadn't conducted, mostly for information about the building's previous tenants and construction history. The searches were deleted by the time I checked the next day, but I remembered enough details to know they hadn't been mine. Someone was using my workstation after hours, researching things I had no interest in knowing. The supply closet door was always unlocked, despite the sign requiring all employees to keep it secured. Inside, boxes were rearranged regularly, stacked in different configurations that seemed deliberate rather than random. A box of copy paper was always positioned to create a small hiding space behind it, just large enough for someone to crouch in. The carpet in that corner was compressed, showing the impression of knees and feet. I found a small notebook wedged between two boxes, filled with observations about my daily routine written in handwriting I almost recognized. The elevator music played a song I knew but couldn't name. The melody was familiar, something I might have heard in childhood, but the tempo was wrong, slower than it should be, with occasional notes that didn't belong to the original composition. The music stopped abruptly between floors, replaced by a voice speaking too quietly to understand. By the time the doors opened, the normal background music had resumed, leaving me to wonder if I'd imagined the interruption. The photocopier produced extra copies without being asked. I'd request 10 copies of a document and receive 12, the additional pages showing slight variations in contrast or alignment. The extras were always placed at the bottom of the stack, easy to miss unless I counted carefully. These copies had a different texture, slightly rougher paper that felt handmade rather than manufactured. When I held them up to the light, they showed watermarks that weren't present in the originals. The thermostat was set to a temperature that shouldn't have been comfortable, but the office always felt perfect. Too warm according to the digital readout, yet I never felt overheated. Other people complained about the temperature regularly, adjusting their clothing or commenting on the stuffiness, but I remained comfortable regardless of the setting. I began to suspect that my perception of temperature had been altered somehow, or that the thermostat was reading conditions in a different room entirely. The trash can beside my desk was emptied on a different schedule than the others. While the cleaning crew emptied most waste baskets every evening, mine was cleared at irregular intervals, sometimes multiple times per day. I started paying attention to what I discarded, making mental notes of crumpled papers and empty coffee cups. Items disappeared selectively, with some trash remaining while other pieces vanished. Someone was sorting through my waste, looking for specific things I had thrown away. The ceiling tiles above my workspace showed water stains that changed shape over time. What started as a small discoloration grew into patterns that resembled maps or floor plans. The building superintendent insisted there were no leaks in the roof and no plumbing in that area, but the stains continued to evolve. I took pictures to document the changes, but the photos never captured the stains clearly. They appeared blurred or distorted in every image, as if the camera couldn't focus properly on that particular section of ceiling. The door handle to the supply room was always cold, regardless of the ambient temperature. Metal conducts heat and cold efficiently, but this handle felt like ice even on warm days. I started wearing gloves when I needed supplies, but the cold penetrated through the fabric. The sensation lingered on my palm long after I'd let go, a numbing chill that reminded me of touching something that had been stored in a freezer. Other people didn't seem to notice the temperature difference, grasping the handle normally without any reaction. The final light switch at the end of the hallway controlled nothing that I could identify. I flipped it experimentally, but no lights turned on or off, no equipment started or stopped. Yet the switch showed signs of regular use, worn smooth by countless fingers. I asked maintenance about its purpose, but they claimed it was disconnected, a leftover from previous renovations. Despite being supposedly inactive, the switch was always in a different position when I checked it, suggesting someone was using it regularly for reasons I couldn't determine.